Hello, and welcome to the webcast. This is the first session of our virtual 2022 Building Opportunity Conference, providing insight for companies operating in the built world. Before we begin, I'm going to play a brief video.
Welcome, and thanks for joining us. We're pleased to present another in our ongoing series of continuing professional education webcasts to help companies and individuals conquer challenges as they plan for what's next. Our presentation will start in a few moments. Before we begin, here are a few things to keep in mind. You can customize how you both view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can also adjust window size and placement, or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons, each relating to a different aspect of our session. You can download the group attendance sheet and a PDF copy of today's slides from the slide deck and handouts widget to the right of the slide view. You can ask our presenter questions during the webcast by typing a question in the Q&A window below the slide view and clicking Submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions during the presentation or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty during today's presentation, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. Today's session will offer you 1 CPE credit. To receive credit, you must meet the requirements as specified by the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy. You must attend at least 50 minutes of the session and respond to at least 75% of the polling questions, which we'll ask throughout today's presentation. To respond to a poll, click the button next to your answer. We'll track your progress and alert you when you've earned CPE credit. You can then click the certificate icon in the CPE Progress widget to open a PDF file that you can save to your computer. Don't worry if you can't download your PDF certificate today. We'll email a copy to you in 2 weeks. If you're attending this webcast in a group, you must complete our attendance sheet to receive CPE credit. The attendance sheet is available in the slide deck and handouts widget. Please have all group members sign it and send only 1 sheet per group. Also note that CPE credit can be awarded only to participants registered as themselves and isn't available to participants who view the on-demand version. As a reminder, the presentation you're about to see isn't legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
Over the span of this conference, we will cover topics including economic updates, how innovations, policy changes, societal shifts, and more drive growth opportunities, and how to attract and retain top industry talent. More information around our conference and its sessions, including registration, are available in the links provided in your resources widget here on On24, as well as on mossadams.com. Today, we have our keynote session, The Future of Cities and Urban Planning, featuring Greg Lindsay. Greg is a journalist, urbanist, futurist, and speaker. He's an urban tech fellow at Cornell Tech, a senior fellow of MIT's Future Urban Collectives Lab, and a non-resident senior fellow of the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Strategy Initiative. He's the chief communication officer at Climate Alpha, a new AI-powered platform for evaluating climate risks. Greg, thank you for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with all of you again here, to return 2 years after my last appearance at this conference. And it's a great way to sort of start from the opening here, because of course 2 years ago, we honestly weren't sure what the future of cities was, or if they even had a future, during, of course, a time then of many people leaving for the countryside and smaller communities, and of course still an era of lockdowns. Fortunately, cities have returned. We returned to urban life, and normality has been restored to society in many ways, but not all is well when it comes to the future of cities and their functions. I'm joining you here from Roosevelt Island at Cornell Tech University's campus, and just over the East River from me, of course, is a midtown that is filled with empty office buildings. And we see this ongoing debate here about whether the return to office will ever actually happen. I don't believe I have it in this deck, but the latest numbers from Castle Systems, their weekly update has come out. And after a bump, for example, that we saw post Labor Day, has flatlined again, less than 50% occupancy since the pandemic. So we've filled our cities with buildings that are mostly empty, and now we're desperately trying to figure out what to do with them and how work will be physically located again. But at the same time, the difference between now and 2 years ago, of course, is that now we see, of course, this incredible vibrancy in cities that has returned. Even if people are still choosing to be as remote as we are, allowing, of course, this great convening from across the country in a single place, we still see this hunger to return face to face. Richard Florida, of course, who wrote the piece "Why Downtown Won't Die," has taken to referring to downtowns as central connectivity districts, which I hope doesn't catch on as a phrase, but he does have the right idea. We see things like, of course, dining out, according to Open Table and others. We see in residential rents in Manhattan and some other cities that that basically people are pouring back to the city. That there's been population booms in several cities that were believed to have previously emptied out during the pandemic. And that's my favorite there. Again, Bloomberg headlines here that things are so good when it comes to people returning to Manhattan that there's never been a worse time to actually rent an apartment here. So why are people staying there? Well, there's some interesting things, of course, we've seen post-pandemic. Obviously, the debates that raged across the United States in terms of appropriate behavior in the pandemic, degrees of freedom versus social risk, has led to a polarization of the urban realm, just like every other aspect of American society has been polarized. So here you can sort of see Axios polling showing that, yes, the cost of living is less of an issue for many of these self-identified blue state voters who live in places like Manhattan. While taxes and cost of living has, of course, led many others, as we've seen, of course, to leave some of the high-cost coastal metros and head to the Sun Belt, where Sun Belt cities have, of course, been some of the biggest beneficiaries. And when it comes to the office, we'll return to this, but when it comes to the office, we see much higher occupancy rates in places like Dallas, Fort Worth, and Houston. And of course, Miami, one of the huge beneficiaries in a way of the pandemic, because of those sort of changes in lifestyles and where people choose to locate. And it's interesting to see, and I'll move on in a second here, but we can see this in this poll of college students, Gen Z, where we can see basically different choices of cities. That young self-identified Republicans preferring Austin, while Democrats and Independents looking at New York and Seattle as a top two. And while many cities like Chicago and others, Los Angeles, make the list, some have completely different possible destinations. And then I remember this from last summer. I thought this was interesting too, that we've seen also a change in lifestyles. That, of course, during the pandemic, there was a mass shift, of course, towards having more personal living space, given that the public realm was closed off to us. But even then, you can see that, that based on political identification, even across other demographics, those who identify, as left of center there are still preferring more of an urban realm versus those who would rather have the countryside. And so this, of course, has massive ramifications for housing markets, for cities, for rents, for all sorts of things. And this, of course, is coupled together with the shift to remote work, which is arguably perhaps going to be the greatest urban legacy of the pandemic in many ways. In the sense of, we saw, this is Nicholas Bloom at Stanford University, the scholar of this, who's shown that, that even if remote work settles at 30%, that is still a six-tupling of basically remote work levels before massive savings in commuting time and elsewhere. So, this, of course, already playing into the fact we've now seen several studies, for example, showing that, number one, we're seeing a convergence of salaries across the United States. Tech workers, the most highly sought after when it comes to talent as a category. We're seeing in major metros, as you can see in this slide, are all now converging on the highly paid salaries of the San Francisco Bay Area. Here's the Castle slide. Here we can see here that occupancy, again, as I mentioned earlier, is mostly sort of flatlined. And then I think what's also interesting is, as I pointed out too, we can see that, people are willing to go back to NBA games, people are willing to go out and dining, but 44%. There's a real cultural resistance to this, and you can imagine people coughing to their bosses that they have to stay home. But this is what I think is interesting too. We've now seen several papers, one from the Fed and one from the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco just recently, showing that the huge pandemic era run-up in housing prices was triggered much by remote work. And this slide's a little bit technical there, but we can see direct correlations now that communities with higher remote work ratios actually saw bigger appreciations in housing prices, and raised the specter that perhaps there will be a sort of permanent level of inflation in housing prices in areas where remote work is predominant. This also, of course, has big changes in metros themselves. Nick Bloom and his co-authors have pointed out that, in New York, this is one example, but I've seen similar graphs for Atlanta and elsewhere. We now see what they call the donut effect, where we see a decline in residential prices in the cores of cities, big appreciation in their sort of, outlying, wealthier enclaves and suburbs. Here in New York, it's communities like Westchester County, but also Rhinebeck and other sort of towns, Hudson, that were seen as desirable. And then, of course, exurban commuting belts and sort of poorer areas beyond. So if we see this play out, this, of course, has huge ramifications for developable areas. And it also leads to sort of the changes in sort of the housing market as well, in terms of the fact that this rise in housing and affordability, first triggered by the rise in asset prices, and now, of course, being triggered by higher interest rates, is leading many home builders and others to create the new category of build to rent. So Lennar here, for example, raising $4 billion, and this is some of the slides from their deck for this, showing here about the fact that we now see, even though, of course, multifamily, a very much a traditional investor class product, doesn't exactly have, the large-scale footprints and multiple bedrooms that Americans prefer to have. And so this huge boom here in single-family rentals, in part fueled by the fact that we underbuilt after the last financial crisis. So it raises really interesting times here about, perhaps we'll start to see, will we see a permanent generation of renters start to happen? And will we see entire master plan communities designed for rentals in single-family scale? Already, Invitation Homes, spun out of Blackstone, in the last few years, is now hiring home builders to design complete neighborhoods from scratch, custom-built homes, turning them into this kind of almost commercial asset class. And if you don't believe me, if you don't take my word for it, take Adam Newman's. The quasi-disgraced WeWork founder, of course, has returned from his exile, his very wealthy exile after his exit from WeWork, and now, of course, has become an apartment mogul. First buying up, amenity-rich buildings, multifamily across the American Sunbelt in exactly the kind of markets that we're talking about, Nashville, Miami, and others. And then, of course, has raised $350 million from Andreessen Horowitz to basically create Flow, trying to create a branded, tech-enabled form of housing. And so, when I, of course, read this, I immediately thought that, yes, if we are tired from working from home, how about living from WeWork, right? Like thinking about how do you create a commercialized product for those remote workers who move to the Sunbelt. So it's fascinating to sort of see here that, that housing, which of course, one of the most resistant categories to creating networks of branded real estate, might be at last being consumed by the tech bubble as Adam Newman and others start to think about how can we actually start to automate and apply fintech to basically turn renters perhaps into owners, as Adam is sort of intimated, but at least create this kind of branded offering, lifestyle offerings with rich amenities around them. So that brings me to the end of the section here. This talk is structured in a number of sections. But first I want to ask you the first poll question. I'd love to see this. What percentage of Americans will own their homes in 2040? Right now, of course, because of America as a nation of homeowners is around 60%, but do you believe that could decline? And how much could it decline as we see ever affluent more Americans are forced or choose to rent because of the pressures in the housing market? So please enter your answer.
Thank you, Greg. Yes, please enter in your answer. And once you click on the button next to your answer choice, remember to go to the submit button and hit submit. That's how your answer is recorded. If you can't see the button, please enlarge the slide area within your web browser. And as a reminder, if you would like to receive CPE credit for today's webcast, you'll need to respond to at least 3 of the 4 polling questions. All right, so we'll give everyone a few more moments to respond. And in the interim, I'd also like to remind you that if you have any questions at all for Greg, please submit them in your Q&A tool here on On24. We do have quite a bit of content to cover today. If we don't get a chance to respond to your questions during the webcast, we'll do our best to follow up with you afterwards. All right, so we have most of the audience here now responding. Let's take a look at the results. And the clear choice here in the lead at 35.9% is 40. Back over to you, Greg.
Thank you so much. That is a fascinating development there to imagine dipping below 50%, what we can think about the repercussions of that being as we see more and more homes in the hands of investors and owners. I should just quickly note the Wall Street Journal, I believe, has a story today, actually, about home builders basically being approached or cold calling investors to basically offload homes at a discount, given what we're seeing with interest rates. So it'll be very interesting to see how institutional capital, with a lot of dry powder after the pandemic, responds to this high interest rate environment. One question before we go as well, I'll note that each of these sections is standalone, so feel free, leave questions in the Q&A box and we'll try to answer them at the end of each section during the polls. So, since we've already discussed a little bit of remote work, let's quickly talk about the ramifications of this and what it means for the office and organizations going forward, now that work is everywhere. Just quickly here, I want to move to some of the discussions here about sort of predictors of attrition during the Great Resignation. We've moved from the Great Resignation, by the way, all the way now to quiet quitting and quiet firing. I just think it's really interesting. This was from a Harvard Business Review study here that showed that basically, the biggest driver in terms of people leaving high-performing companies like SpaceX or Tesla was what was cited as toxic corporate culture. And given what we've seen in terms of the resistance of people going back to work, I can imagine that perhaps a boss like Elon Musk, who sends these emails, as he did this spring here, where, where the first 40 hours a week you must spend in the office. After that, of course, spend it anywhere you like. It's these kinds of responses, from workers who, of course, been traumatized after 2 years of the pandemic, particularly for work-from-home parents, dealing with childcare and other issues, are choosing, in fact, to basically leave for other jobs or choosing to push back on those policies. And where it gets interesting, of course, is that that employers, of course, have their own reasons for wanting to do things. Number one is, and this I think is sort of a negative one. This is Laszlo Bock. He was the former head of people analytics at Google. Laszlo predicted, I think this is a very interesting take, that that we're going to see 80% failure of hybrid companies. Not in a good way, but they will snap back to the office because these companies will fail to manage hybrid employees and force them back into the office. And I think that's sort of interesting. That sort of speaks to that kind of toxic culture and micromanagement, which I think are the wrong reasons to compel people back to the office. The right reasons why employers want people back is because companies suffered brain damage during remote work. And this, you can see here, this is a fairly technical slide, but this is from a paper that came out in Nature. Microsoft spent the first few months of the pandemic, and as far as I know, continued the study, but this shows you from about the first 4 months, where they took communications data from all of their 61,000 employees and looked at things like, from the literature, weak ties. Weak ties, if you know that phrase from Mark Granovetter, is basically your non-strong ties with people you directly work with and live with every day, but those people at the periphery of your network where you get good ideas from, or where you make other connections, or you help connect with jobs. Those ties within Microsoft and company after company frayed mightily during the pandemic. And we're starting to see the papers come out about basically sort of gaps and delays in innovation, and to some extent, high-level coordination. My friend Ben Weber, who I've written papers with before, he put up this great study looking at the video game industry and work from home. And I thought it was really interesting because, as Ben pointed out, if you think there's any industry that would be prepared for remote work, it would be the people building virtual worlds. We'll come back to the metaverse, but in this case, looking at makers of companies like Epic Games, makers of Fortnite and others, and looked at the fact that during the pandemic, almost all of these companies suffered very expensive delays in their core franchises. They were unable to ship their actual product. The one exception, as Ben and his co-author found out, were some of the Japanese companies that early in the pandemic did not actually work from home. There, they, of course, masked up and took countermeasures and kept coming into the office. And here you can sort of see, they had a control group. There were other Japanese games companies that did go home and do remote work. And by comparing the two, you could actually see, and here's some of the interviews there about, yes, there is, in fact, that value in having those short team breaks and having face-to-face conversations and communication. And that made all the difference in the ability to ship on time. So it'll be interesting to sort of see, when companies like Google, reiterate their value in going back to the office, opening up the new Bayview campus designed by Thomas Heatherwick and Bjarke Ingels, it's still a bet here that, that if you can create a more flexible space with the proper amenities, you can lure people back and continue that advantage. And it has been interesting to sort of see the amenities arms race in terms of where urban work is happening there, or how it might develop. So, if Google is doing this, and I was in Chicago just the other week here, this is the Willis Tower. Having grown up beside Chicago, this was the world's tallest building for most of my life. But here, Blackstone has bought it and renovated it, invested in public art by Olafur Eliasson, putting in an urban food hall and basically reinvesting in the public spaces, and, and putting out a whole new sky deck for employees as well. And I think this is interesting because, of course, even before the pandemic, we saw a whole trend in amenitization of office space. That if we could simply create a rich enough environment, people would be compelled to come into work. I did just have coffee with a friend of mine who works for a very large brokerage. I won't say which one, but she pointed out that the only thing that can get the employees of her clients into the office is the free lunch, which I noted that Bloomberg and other companies have started cutting. But, if you're going to go into the urban core of Chicago, why would you go into the Loop, which of course has, dead street traffic, when then you can go the next neighborhood over to Fulton Street Market, which of course, another classic example of a former industrial low-slung neighborhood that has a rich amenities, that has people dining out. And now we're starting to see the construction of new office buildings there. So here, the best place to actually find work or to lure workers back is to already go to an amenity-rich, walkable neighborhood and then put your office there versus trying to reverse the process. And we're also seeing that happen out in the exurbs. Given the home shifts that we saw, some of the most vibrant places in America right now are these urban nodes in exurban areas. You're looking at, for example, at Avalon. This is in Alpharetta, Georgia, developed by Mark Toro, who's now developing others. I'll show you his next project in a moment. But I talked to Mark this summer, and he actually argued that that places like Avalon are actually now better positioned than urban cores because they never had those lockdowns and because people have moved there. And he made the provocative argument that that when it comes to urban life, a place like Avalon is now more lively and more urbane than places like Midtown Atlanta or the Loop in Chicago, which I think speaks to sort of the very tough road ahead for those sort of urban cores here as they try to get people back. And as for Mark, he's doubling down on this. This is his next site, taking over a former dead State Farm suburban office park to turn that into the next version of Avalon. And I think if there's a real redevelopment community here in America, or redevelopment opportunity, it's going to be these suburban office parks, which are going to suffer even more than urban cores, having a lack of possible amenities around them. So, yeah, in these areas, which started, of course, as bedroom communities that are now springing up these walkable urban areas, this is perhaps, the new frontier when it comes to rethinking what our urban experience should be. But I just want to end this section on a final note, which is thinking about, that if we've shown during the pandemic that, that we don't necessarily have to work in the same space 5 days a week that we commute to, we can also work alone in our bedrooms and be individually as productive as possible. Perhaps there's a happier medium as well. Perhaps we should be rethinking the patterns of work and with whom we do it. And I'm inspired by this quote by Bill Joy, formerly was at Sun Microsystems: no matter who you are, most of the smartest people work for someone else. This, of course, aimed at the idea that, you simply can't corner the market on talent. I know that'll be a conversation later in the series. But you could actually work alongside them. And I think that's really interesting. The one thing we haven't seen yet is more buildings like this one in Brooklyn called New Lab. New Lab is sort of, as you can tell from the design there, a bit of like a WeWork in the sense of it brings together numerous startups and individuals who work out of those spaces. But there's a very rigorous culture in place there to allow cross-pollination. In fact, large companies like Hershey's and Verizon and others come there and create consulting projects where the owner-operators of New Lab actually bring startups together and actually create these sort of design sprints to work for clients. You can create value by actually being located there. And I think there's a real frontier in this, the notion of I'm very curious to see if we'll see various employers start to co-locate similar teams from different companies, perhaps in different industries, so they can learn peer-to-peer and have that real reason for coming in. Not necessarily feeling bound by having to talk to colleagues, but actually being able to sort of commiserate across industries. So it'll be very interesting to see if we can move beyond simply the nominal coworker and the work from home individual into these kinds of new networks. And I'll stop here for our next poll section here, which I think gets back to I'm curious your individual preferences. Who do you want to work with and where? Do you want to work in a space with your colleagues, people you draw the same paycheck from? Do you want to work in a space with my peers, like a New Lab, where you don't necessarily have to deal with corporate politics? Would you rather be home alone, working from home and setting your own hours, or would you rather be any place else alone? Which speaks to this idea of having new forms of co-working spaces, perhaps a short commute away, but not having to schlep into an office every day. So I hand it over for polling.
All right. Thank you, Greg. So again, we'll give the audience a couple moments here to select their answer here directly on the slide. And then once you select your answer, remember to hit the submit button so that it is recorded. In the meantime, we do have a question for you, Greg, from the audience. It reads, when it comes to housing, do you think that there will be a shift towards renovating and reinvesting in current infrastructure rather than build up new neighborhoods in an effort to build more resilient urban spaces?
That is a very great question in multiple senses. So definitely, obviously, given what we're seeing with interest rates, I think we're actually seeing much more home renovations than purchases. The American housing market is grinding to a halt as we speak. So I think that's interesting. Well, also, the second trend there is, of course, is the rise that we've seen things like accessory dwelling units. We've seen legislation passed during the pandemic in Minnesota and California and elsewhere, allowing construction of so-called tiny homes and backyard spaces in other areas. So I think we will see, actually more construction on various lots. And then your third point, yeah, it'll be very interesting to sort of see how resilience continues as well. Obviously, Hurricane Ian will come back to climate change, raises again, sort of the resilience of entire areas, but also we've seen institutes pop up to allow people to invest in more fire-resilient roofing, obviously, mounting up homes on stilts. Right now, resilience is very much an individual case. And until that changes at a policy level, I think you're right. We're going to see people start to make investments, particularly in these higher risk areas, that will allow them to perhaps stay in place while dealing with that higher and elevated risk.
Understood. Thank you. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at the results for this polling question. Leading the way at 43.2%, option A, in a space with my colleagues.
All right, back to the office. Thank you all. Back to the office. Interesting split there with number 2 is those who want to keep with remote work. So very interesting. I'm personally B myself. Let's keep it moving here. All that is retail melts into air. Let's discuss, of course, during the pandemic, we saw the huge boom in e-commerce that happened. And I thought this was a very interesting slide because JP Morgan and many others thought that we had seen a turbocharging in e-commerce, that this was going to be the latest step change, and that line would keep going up to the right forever. In the last year or so, of course, just about a year ago, we saw the rise of so-called quick commerce and 15-minute delivery. companies like Gorillas out of Berlin and Getter out of Turkey, creating this whole model of having all of your things you need delivered within 15 minutes or less. And in doing so, and this is what I thought was very interesting, is they, here in Manhattan, taking over storefronts along 14th Street. Here's one that Gorillas took over, turning retail into a new form of industrial, often stripping it down completely, banning customers from stores and turning it into these micro-fulfillment hubs. Then, of course, two things happened. Number one, we saw the fact that, this is actually more of a realization. We did see a boom in e-commerce, but it plateaued. It's at a new level, but it is not continuing up. And then, of course, we saw the spigot of very inexpensive money turned off, which stranded many of the so-called quick commerce companies. But the changes have continued. I think it's just sort of varied in different ways. So, for example, this random liquor store in LA has now been transformed by Travis Kalanick's cloud solutions, cloud retail, and cloud kitchens into creating now this sort of armature, this platform for launching on-demand retail. And here's a couple of slides quickly from what Travis's company is offering there in terms of going to consumer packaged good companies and basically sort of trying to deconstruct the grocery store and retail and putting it back together. But again, in doing so, creating this sort of archipelago of locations where you can now launch brands much more quickly ever before. So, you can have TikTok Kitchen. You can basically have recipes and food that's seen as TikTok that you can now deploy at scale. The first example of this, which you may have heard, was Mr. Beast, the YouTube celebrity, who literally overnight launched a Mr. Beast burger in more than 300 locations across the country because of using the DoorDash platform, much like what Travis is doing there. Also related to that, we've seen this whole push because of that exurban shift. We're now seeing the rise of sort of hyper modular turnover when it comes to delivery. Taco Bell launching this pneumatic tube, much ballyhooed version of it where food drops down to you in a line. And Matt Newberg, who runs the great website Hungry, has pointed out that we've seen chains like Dutch Brothers Coffee, which is out of Arizona, or at least that's where I've seen it here. They're in the foreground of this frame here, taking otherwise undevelopable parcels and creating sort of modularized drive-through only locations. And in doing so, creating their own kinds of 15-minute cities or 15-minute commerce, only instead of a bicycle messenger coming to you, it's basically dropping, as you can see here, this like zone of coverage that allows you to find one within 15 minutes. So I think that's interesting. The other one I've noted is Instacart, of course, which started as, a sort of home shopper service, right? Had almost 500,000 gig employees at one point who were going to stores on behalf of people during the pandemic. Well, they've since pivoted now and are now creating middleware solutions to allow retailers to offer things like 15 minutes or less. So if you're in Miami and you're in the Wynwood or Brickell areas, you can use the Publix app to have an ever-increasing selection of goods delivered to you in 15 minutes from their stores. And by from their stores, I don't mean a stripped-down convenience store. I mean a highly automated environment using technology from the Israeli company Fabric, which is basically turning 20% of this big box store into an industrialized warehouse. And I think it's very interesting here that, that we're going to see, instead of disrupting, the retail market, now these technology companies are enabling them and empowering them. And it will be interesting to see as this starts to play out at scale, particularly in new build developments. So the project from the pandemic that I'm the most interested in is this dead mall, the Hilltop Mall in Richmond, California, purchased by Prologis, obviously the largest industrial REIT in the country. And they've asked for a zoning variance change to turn it into their first mixed-use project. If they're permitted, they'll turn this into a combination of retail, housing, makes sense during the California housing crisis, but also industrial there as well. And when I read that, I thought of a provocation by my friend Anthony Townsend here at Cornell Tech in his book Ghost Road about autonomous vehicles, thinking through that just as we once had beds and sheds, we might start to have beds above sheds. The idea of actually having building housing above these warehouses where the amenity becomes actually having delivery into your home in 15 minutes or less. Sorry there, my friend Ellie Feingold, who now runs prop tech investment for Crow Holdings out of Dallas, has referred to this as from street to suite. The idea that, that if e-commerce was about the last mile, now the battle is that last meter across the threshold of delivering services personally into your home or into your office or other spaces. So Walmart, for example, which started its service of doing home delivery and suspended during the pandemic, now aims to expand that footprint to more than 24 million households, where Walmart workers wearing body cameras put your groceries away for you. And the reason they're wearing body cameras is not for their safety or yours, but to actually gather data from your refrigerator, because it's the only way that you can compete with Amazon and its own data collection. But this idea here of imagine living in a home there that has this branded amenity of having everything you need delivered right to your house. And similarly, Mark Lohr, founder of Jet.com, has sold out to Amazon before, is now back with his new startup, Wonder, which is using Mercedes Sprinter vans and mobile kitchens to basically deliver gourmet, finished cooked meals directly to your doorstep. This has the neighbors in New Jersey and its test markets a little up in arms, but it raises questions again about what that 15-minute delivery means, what that new form of convenience will be, and perhaps it will be Sprinter vans in the suburbs rather than bike messengers. And the final version of that one, which I'm constantly, enamored with, is Reef Technology, which is a SoftBank bank startup that basically bought up 4,500 parking lots in urban cores around the country and started using them to borrow from the phrase from Riley Brennan, the venture capitalist, that parking is real estate in hiding. And basically what Reef wanted to do was bring out that real estate by creating, not just what we think of as shipping containers or food trucks, but as my friend Brian Boyer put it, at the University of Michigan, really it's a minimum viable building. They sort of disassembled the building and recreated its functionality, at least, without having to actually obey the sort of zoning and permitting involved. So, Reef has had a harder time of it than some of the others, but I do think it's interesting in the sense of like what they're trying to do is sort of create this GIF, you can see it, real estate that vanishes and reappears. Using, instead of location, they're using data to collect that analysis and deploy infrastructure out there. And I've had some interesting conversations with the design team where they're constantly investing in how can we create this sort of modular form of infrastructure that we can skin, unskin, and redeploy as needed. So it'll be very interesting to sort of see if Reef can crack that model. My favorite thing is apparently they bought parking lots so quickly and so hastily that in many cases they bought the wrong parking lots and had to lease them while they bought others where they could deploy their infrastructure. All right, so this raises the question here about your own sort of personal tolerance there about e-commerce after the pandemic. How quick should commerce be? 15 years ago, it was overnight from big hubs in places like Memphis and Louisville, FedEx and UPS overnight air. Then, of course, it became same day as Amazon and others built giant distribution centers in the periphery of cities. Then we saw the push for 15 minutes or less from urban cores. Or if you're like me, as fast as my legs can carry me, where I actually still prefer and love going back to shopping in person and don't find that a chore, but rather a pleasure to actually sort of frequent my local businesses. So A, B, C, or D?
All right. So while the audience puts in their answers for this polling question, just a quick reminder, once the session is over, the On24 platform here will be sending a couple of resources via email to all attendees, including a link to a recording of this webcast in case you want to go back and re-listen to the content that Greg is delivering here. So while the audience continues to put in their answers, Greg, we do have a new question from someone who's watching. He writes, do you think tax codes will change to promote home ownership or get more restrictive that eventually turns us into a renter's nation?
That's a great question too. I have not followed enough sort of the ongoing debates over SALT. I mean, as a former and now current New Yorker again, although I don't own my own home there, but like obviously that's something particularly for wealthier residents in those high tax, high service, in theory, states and metros. Obviously, that's a huge deal there. And it is interesting. I'll be curious to see. I mean, we've seen the biggest, most explosive growth, obviously, in both multifamily and single family in those metros like Phoenix and Nashville and others that saw that explosive growth. And it'll be curious. I mean, I think obviously, once you see large capital like a Blackstone come into play, given their ability to lobby, perhaps we'll actually see, I guess if I have to choose your binary, I would guess I'm going to choose more restrictive, that we'll see, further closing of the tax loopholes, which is something that we can see, even our divided Congress can get behind, like what we saw with Senator Manchin and others when it came to the IRA, that if we can basically pay for these initiatives by closing that tax loophole, perhaps that further pushes people into rentership, which in theory, I'll say just in passing is like, I think there's an interesting conversation to be had about, should home equity be how we see people, building wealth, intergenerational wealth versus putting into equities markets. I don't think it's a great idea that, that a handful of large investors should perhaps pocket all of the equity there. And I hope there'll be a larger conversation about, are we denying, particularly in American communities of color that never had the benefits of multiple generations of homeownership, is that a path that's being foreclosed to them? So I hope we'll see more of that by our representatives in Congress and discussing like what is our actual policy goal in this particular case.
Thank you, Greg. Let's take a look at the results for this polling question. All right, pretty close between the first two options, overnight and same day.
All right, well, I'm glad to know. Thank you. I'm glad to know that we're not overly spoiled here for options here, although, I would love to see D a little bit higher there. But yes, as someone who's getting my Amazon packages shipped to me again here because I'm back in an office, I understand the impulse completely. All right, well, great. Well, we still got some time here. I think we're gonna have some good time at the end for more questions. So again, please leave your questions in the Q&A. We'll address them between sections and then also have some time at the end if needed. So thank you all for your questions. All right, well, I think we have two major sections left here. This is gonna be a bit of a downer before we have a little bit a lighter affair at the end. But obviously, we can't have this conversation, particularly in the aftermath of Hurricane Ian, without discussing, that we all should be seeking higher ground. The science fiction novelist Bruce Sterling has a great one-sentence prediction of the future. Old people in cities, frightened of the sky. I love this sentence because, of course, it captures the three megatrends that define this century, one of which, of course, is demographics. With the exception of India, every global civilization is aging very rapidly. I just saw latest updates in China that China's population might fall in half by century's end because of the one-child policy and other measures there. But we of course we're seeing a much older populace that's happening. That of course, as we saw in Hurricane Ian, which I'll come to in a moment there, where basically it hit communities that were much older. Many of the retirees had moved to Florida and therefore had less resources and less mobility to evacuate or cope with the damage that was being done. Second, people in cities, of course, we're going through a whole wave of urbanization, as you well know. Currently most of by mid-century, 75% or more of humanity will have moved away from villages into some form of urbanity. And then, of course, frightened of the sky refers to climate change itself. More than 40% of Americans suffered a climate disaster last year, whether it was fires. This is a Greek woman watching her home burn in the fires of September 21. But whether it was climate fires, whether it was flooding, whether it was Hurricane Ian, whether it's people leaving smoke from the wildfires burning out west that, of course, require families to have HEPA filtration for a week or more. The heat domes we've seen in the Northwest last year and in California now. I could go on and on, obviously. But it's creating these risks, and it raises these questions about sort of where will any place be safe? It's not, of course, just the fires, and it's not just the hurricanes. Here's, First Street Foundation, which builds flood reactor and other risks. I don't know if you can see my Hurricane Ian slide there, if it's skipped over. There's Ian there with electricity, if it's playing there on the main screen. But here I'm looking right now at, you can sort of see, First Street Foundation here, imagining an extreme heat belt where we see days above 125 Fahrenheit, stretching all the way from the Gulf of Mexico, where you might expect, but all the way through Illinois and other Great Plains states, in addition to the Southwest or Southeast. We can also imagine, for example, sorry, I'm giving a little out of sequence on the slides here. Now you can sort of see that slide. But then also we can imagine drought as well in terms of water resources and where that goes. This is from Redfin data where they simply calculated, and I'm just showing you, this is the portion of the list where 100% of the homes face drought conditions. You can map this against the fact that many of these, including Vegas, Austin, San Antonio, Dallas, and so forth, Salt Lake City, were also the fastest growing regions during the pandemic and for many years before that. So, we're seeing people, as we like to say at Climate Alpha, are moving in the wrong direction. And I won't belabor too much about what we're doing, but, here we're seeing, that if America has a shortfall of housing, 4 million homes, are we making sure we're going to build them in the right place? Where should we be thinking about steering future American growth, given the risks that are going to form that we're already seeing here? So again, Climate Alpha, this is a company founded by my friend Parag Khanna. He and I wrote an essay in 2013 called Where Will You Live in 2050? And we argued at the time, to sort of, spitballing between us, that you would choose to live in a place with good governance and preferably good climate resilience. The joke there is that he moved to Singapore and I moved to Montreal. So we each sort of chose our half of the bet. But one of our arguments, and we see this with Ian, and we're seeing this if you follow the news coverage there, about the fact that the Florida insurance market was already shaky. That we're seeing, based on estimates, between $30 and $60 billion in damages to Florida here. Will we see perhaps, given also what FEMA has done in changing the risk models and making it even harder to get flood insurance, will we see a similar moment to 2008, where suddenly we realize that all that AAA debt and credit default swaps was not as AAA as we thought? Will we see that perhaps American AAA housing in the Florida Gulf Coast is not as AAA as we thought either, and we'll suffer another Minsky moment where suddenly we write down that value? So this is the kinds of thing we're thinking of, and many others. We've seen a rise of companies like Climate Alpha and like ours that are working with large reinsurers and others to think through about where do we start to steer growth and how do we put policies in place. And we're starting to see, we just saw, for example, the announcement by the U.S. Treasury Department, a new committee that will basically evaluate climate risks, both within portfolios of large financial institutions, but also more broadly in U.S. society. So we're seeing both the Fed and the Treasury and the SEC under Gary Gensler are both looking very astutely into what kind of systemic risks that this sort of climate is creating. But also, we sort of see it creates these opportunities as well. And this is what we're trying to do at Climate Alpha. Our whole argument is not, it's about trying to figure out how much money and how slowly or quickly you'll lose it in climate risk areas. But where can we start to steer opportunity and investment there? And we've built a whole suite of tools that we think will help you identify that. Again, I won't sell over that. But we're trying to figure out that intersection of demographic, socioeconomic, and climate variables to point out where those fast-growing regions will be in the future. And basically, in their case, help customers get there. Because, of course, people aren't waiting. We saw during the pandemic that many Americans already started to move. The earliest signal, the earliest use case was, of course, the boom in RVs. If you remember that summer of 2020, of course, when people were reluctant to stay at hotels, we saw this huge boom of people traveling across the country, spending time in the great outdoors. And this has led to some interesting startups that are doing this as a lifestyle. The rise of so-called digital nomads, you can sort of see here, was what was once, affluent backpacker programmers going across, Bali and Chiang Mai, is now becoming more of a mainstream phenomenon, where we're starting to think through what people are actually thinking about, do I migrate among a handful of metros, or where else should I go? And I think that's really fascinating, because in response to that, we've seen a number of far-sighted metros are rethinking their economic development strategies in light of this. Tulsa Remote was one of the first and arguably the most successful. Working with the Kaiser Foundation, they gave away $10,000 in cash to more than 2,000 people to date who have moved there while keeping their jobs somewhere else, becoming digital nomads, resettling in their community, and sort of spending and becoming part of that urban fabric. To me, it's a really interesting case there. We've seen this in Northwest Arkansas as well, where they give you $10,000 and a mountain bike, because they're very proud of their mountain biking. But to me, in talking to the people operating these programs, it points to the fact that there's a new sort of specialty emerging at the intersection of what traditionally would have been a city or a chamber of commerce's tourism and economic development strategies. Rather than pursuing economic development where you're trying to lure employers or job creators with tax incentives and other blunt financial instruments, perhaps the new battle is to actually win individual hearts and minds and convince them to move to your community and use creative class-style amenities as the draw. And I think communities are getting more and more creative about this. There's a platform based out of Indiana that's also gone nationwide called Make My Move. Evan Hawk, the founder of that, is talk to universities and cities like West Lafayette, Indiana, just over the border from where I grew up in Illinois. But there, the city is working with Purdue University to make the university's amenities, its gym, its pools, those sorts of things, available to people who might move there. So combining personal financial incentives with discounts on housing and offer of concierge services to help put people into schools, we're starting to see these communities are realizing that there's an opportunity to revitalize themselves one by one from the bottom up. And I think, again, we're going to start to see new real estate types and new kinds of amenities to match this. During the pandemic, Common, the co-living company that sort of survived and swallowed all of its rivals, launched a competition called the Remote Work Hub, where they asked developers in a handful of cities, including Bentonville, Arkansas, Rochester, New York, Provo, Utah, a mix of Rust Belt and big Sunbelt fast growers, to rethink what these typologies could be. One of the winners was in New Orleans, but the project didn't move ahead. They were going to use city-owned land. But the idea, of course, was in that case was to create a new form of multifamily housing designed for remote workers moving to New Orleans, but not just work-from-home bedrooms, but also actually putting in managed conference facilities on the first floor and daycares and creating new amenities for that kind of live, work, remote there. So I think it'll be interesting to sort of see what kind of programs are put together for those kinds of new arrivals coming from someplace else. And, Parag and I, again, this is something we've thought about at Climate Alpha. We call this from cloud companies to cloud people. This is a riff on the idea that, that the next great place for founding startups, as they say, will not be the San Francisco Bay Area. It'll be in the cloud. It'll be all remote organizations. And in that case, we could see, highly motivated, highly realized people floating from place to place. And they'll need new services to match them. We'll start to see the rise of life as a service in this particular case. Combination of co-working, co-living, car sharing, having things available to them. We've seen overseas, various governments like Estonia and Spain, I think more than 24 have launched digital nomad visas, where encouraging you to move and work there for a year. So thinking through what these various services could be for an ever more mobile workforce. All right, that takes us to the end of our second to last section. We've got one more here. But first, what climate disaster would make you move? I'm curious, what are people afraid of in this particular case? The fires next time, a riff there on Richard Baldwin, thinking through about, of course, the fires out west, both the smoke and the risk there. Another category like Ian, obviously this pertains to your own geography in the country, so we'll see where people are. An increase in flooding, would just simply an increase in sunny day flooding where your home is bound to flood from groundwater coming up through your drains, cause you to move? Or D, you're never going to leave, that basically culture and family and sense of place is simply too strong no matter what the risk.
Thank you, Greg. So while everyone here tries to put in their answer for the fourth polling question, just as a reminder from the orientation video at the start of the session today, once you have completed all CPE requirements, you will be able to download a PDF of your certificate from the CPE progress window here on On24. If you have any difficulties at all, though, downloading that certificate, that PDF file, rest assured we will be emailing all qualified attendees their certificate within 2 weeks or so of the session ending, so later this month. All right, so while the audience continues submitting their answers, we do have another question in queue for you, Greg. From the audience, It reads, What area of the U.S., in your opinion, is best suited for climate change?
See, this is a particularly interesting question because the true answer to that is that, like many other things, it's fractal. We can't just say, like, for example, Vermont, which shows up in many polls as the most climate resilient place in America. And again, I moved across just over the border to Montreal, where incredible, cool weather, great freshwater sources, 98% renewable electricity from Hydro-Quebec. Those are great, but what we're going to see is that there will be parts of every city, even the ones that have the highest level of climate risk, that are going to be protected. And it will raise some really interesting questions. Investors will choose those already privileged neighborhoods and reinforce them, increase their resilience, and reference that earlier question. But also we're going to need to have national policy about investing in infrastructure, I think, in places that have been underinvested. I think particularly the Great Lakes. And I wrote an op-ed last year, actually, that President Biden and Congress should make the Great Lakes the center of America's climate strategy in terms of the Inflation Reduction Act and also the infrastructure bill, having climate risk scores that would favor some of these places where, like, you look at cities like Buffalo and Detroit that were built for populations over twice their current size, there's still a lot of great bones. And as we see with changing weather patterns, we might start to see people come back. So I think there's some really interesting opportunities there. But I think we're at our poll completion here.
That we are. Let's take a look at the results. The most popular answer at 34.4% is D. I'm never leaving. Back to you.
Well, there you are. I should have known there's an interesting survey that just came out on this, and we'll start to see how attitudes start to change, or at least when Americans start to move. Redfin, during the pandemic, over the winter of 2020-21, did an online experiment, 17 million people searching for homes. For people looking at homes in high flood risk areas, Cape Coral, Florida, which was just almost destroyed by Hurricane Ian, Houston, and I believe parts of Louisiana, they showed them flood risk scores, basically. And they showed people who were looking at homes in high-risk areas. For the people in that group who saw the score versus the control group, over 50% of the people who then ended up purchasing homes chose more flood-resilient real estate from there. They actually used that data. And so I thought that was really interesting because it shows that Americans really are smart and really are rational, and that perhaps if we give them better tools and give them a better understanding of the risks involved, they might start to make, again, at least more local choices when it comes to that resilience. So it'll be very interesting in the years to come as we start to become more cognizant of this. All right, we have about 13 minutes left here, and so we'll have some time for Q&A. For those of you who've made it this long, welcome to the fun section here. This relates particularly to the work I'm doing here at Cornell Tech, into the metaverse. This is Mark Zuckerberg. He would like you at Meta, which we renamed last fall. He would love it if you would wear a VR headset on your head for 8 to 10 hours a day. Just next week, actually, they're going to drop the Meta Quest Pro, the latest version of the Meta headset of this. That in Mark's world would take the already wonderful experience of so much Zoom calls there and actually have strangers in your house with you at all given times. This is not personally the kind of metaverse that I would like to see, one that would have us basically sort of renounce the outside world for more interiority. But it's not the only one available. And it is going to point to, I think, sort of underscore some shifts we might see in future permutations of remote work. Because the way the metaverse works now, just to be a little dark for a moment here, is we've already seen in Canada, for example, virtual cashiers, automation, where the people are the ones that are providing the automation. Freshie is a Canadian sort of wraps and salads chain. But here there was a scandal, and they announced it, where they were using virtual cashiers who were actually Nicaraguan workers being paid half of minimum wages in California, or sorry, in Toronto in this particular case. So we start to see this sort of outsourcing here. 10 years ago, my friend David Findler at the Institute for the Future started to imagine an artificial intelligence CEO, ICEO. But what it did was to go to gig work platforms, the predecessors of Upwork, to basically hire dozens of human beings to actually do the work, but obscure it from the next level up. So to write a report, it would hire dozens of researchers, and then the next step, dozens of writers, and then the next step, dozens of editors. And with also the rise of generative text AIs like GPT-3, we can start to see more of this. But I started thinking about, now that we've made these investments in remote organizations, what other kinds of remote work and outsourcing would we see? In Japan, for example, they've created, as you can see here, using VR telepresence to actually have humans operate robots. One of the demos was to have a robot stock shelves in a Japanese 7-Eleven. I can't personally imagine the kind of wages involved that would make it more affordable to do that. But we can also think about the ramifications of the pandemic as well. The Japanese government sponsored an ad on Bloomberg's homepage to advertise this robot cafe in Tokyo. The catch is that they're not actually robots. They are humans telepresently operating these robots. Humans, which they proudly discussed, were people who are too ill or too agoraphobic or too bedridden to actually participate in society otherwise. And so the Japanese government was using its combination of robotics, its aging population and its own, cultural idiosyncrasies here to advertise how robotics would have people participate. And I felt this, and I felt this chill of recognition because we've seen in the UK, where we've seen the rising number of people leaving the workforce due to illness. And as we've seen in the United States as well, where an estimated, depending on which paper you see, between Brookings and The Lancet, between 2 and 4 million Americans are currently have left the workforce due to long COVID. Could we start to see participation through the metaverse in everyday tasks? That perhaps the metaverse will be a way for people who are too sick to actually participate in society otherwise, actually start to might regain those wages and regain that lost productivity. So there, I leave that for you in terms of thinking about perhaps this might be one ramification through the metaverse and the pandemic. But for more fun, I started to think about this, about how can we use VR and AR to enhance the urban landscape? So the image you're seeing right now is a well-known man in Hong Kong who is currently playing Pokemon Go across 96 different phones. Apparently he's a well-known public figure riding his bike around. But as you can perhaps see here, if the video will play in a moment here, Evan Spiegel, who's the CEO of Snap, is investing heavily in this notion of augmented reality. The idea of having glasses or even just your smartphone that overlays information on urban space and where you can have services and create value. Apple is supposedly putting the finishing touches on a mixed reality headset that it could drop as early as next year. And if it's anything like the iPhone or even the iPad, which also solved a problem that was 20 years in the making, then you can start to imagine, perhaps that all of a sudden overnight, we now live in a world full of incredible, information being overlaid. So this next video is a demo. This is not real. This was a famous video piece from 2016 by Keiichi Matsuda named Hyperreality, imagining a day in the life of Medellin, Colombia, in a world where AR is commonplace. So imagine wayfinding in streets, but also imagining giant cartoon characters floating around, and of course, advertising and services all about. The interesting thing about this now is that Keiichi Matsuda, I don't know if this will play or not, but Keiichi Matsuda is, left this one out, is actually building this for real. This is just a grab from one of his, from one of the things he's creating now at his new startup, where, basically instead of doing that as a special effect, they're now actually building augmented reality within people's phones using Niantic, which makes Pokemon Go, using their so-called Lightspeed visual positioning system, creating a GPS for augmented reality. And this is significant because we come back to Pokemon Go. Pokemon Go, I would herald as really the harbinger of what we're talking about with the metaverse. And it's something that I think about a lot because, Pokemon Go, when it happened that summer weekend in 2016, was remarkable in the sense of it literally changed social interactions overnight. Suddenly you have these incredible images of multi-generational, multi-ethnic groups coming together to play Pokemon in public space. That was wonderful. The dark side is also perhaps a lot of people died playing Pokemon Go. A pair of researchers at Purdue University worked with the local police in Tippecanoe County, Indiana, to basically calculate the number of people who were injured near Pokestops. And what they found is that people were playing the game while driving, among other reasons. And you may know there were some fun stories about people who were not paying attention to their surroundings and fell off cliffs and other things like this. Well, they took the data they had and they extrapolated across the entire United States. And if this was true, then 30,000 people were injured playing Pokemon Go. That is not insignificant. And that's just the beginning. This was just the first 5 months of the game. If Apple delivers this at scale, what can we find ourselves in? What happens when we live in a world where everything is a service, where we're able to peer inside buildings and see what's for sale or what's for rent, where every potential car, an Uber, now we can actually look around the streetscape and see what's available. But it also is going to create the importance that we need to have guardrails on reality as well. And that's my project here for the next year at Cornell Tech, where we're going to try to work together with cities and companies to start thinking through, what should baseline reality be? How do we ensure that people don't run into the street, or ideally don't play it while driving? How do we at least make it so that the golden snitch in a Harry Potter game or that Pikachu in Pokemon doesn't spawn directly in front of you while you're driving? So these are the kinds of questions I'm thinking about. And of course, it has huge implications for real estate as well, given that we see that Apple, the world's wealthiest company, which already takes 30% of a cut of everything sold through the App Store. What happens when suddenly the App Store is literally everywhere? So I leave it with you on this one. I say I don't have a final concluding discussion on this. We have some time. We have 7 minutes for Q&A, so I'll try to get through it quickly. But I want to thank you for your time in this as we think through some of the implications here about how our interpretations of public and private space have changed. Our expectations for retail and where and how we work have changed. We're now emerging into, I wouldn't even say the post-pandemic at this point, but the post-post-pandemic as we now emerge into what will simply be the rest of our lives. So again, thank you so much. And I turn it over for any questions we have in Q&A.
Thank you, Greg. Let's dip back into the audience Q&A queue. Here we have a question. It's in 2 parts, so I'll give you each part separately. The first part reads, speaking about commerce and the speed of commerce, what spending patterns have changed after the pandemic, and do you think these will continue?
That's a good question. Will they continue? Yes. How long will they continue before our next inflection point will be an interesting question. I do think spending patterns have changed. There was just a piece that came out arguing that, particularly in youth culture, that dining out is the coolest thing you can do. This combination of highly social, relatively exclusive, right? There's only so many reservation slots. That, particularly in those cities, that have a high density of restaurants and amenities, this is becoming the de facto thing. And I think there's a definite amount of truth to that. I mean, given, what are cities for? What are the densest places, most expensive places for? And therefore maximizing that face-to-face social interactivity. So I do think that commerce that plays to those things, I think is the one that's rebounded the fastest, and we saw that. And even again, sporting events and others, bringing together sort of collective events. So I think that's interesting. This pushback to consuming services and experiences versus goods, and that's played out at every level. We went through the whole summer of so-called revenge travel, where people basically had all that pent-up demand for travel and vacations, and I think that's still true. So it'll be really interesting to sort of see what's the future of tourism and those bound-up experiences over the next few years before we emerge into something on the other side. Also, again, high interest rates, what this means for inflation, lots of permutations there. But again, I think that social spending, I think, is going to be a huge trend to continue. And the second half of the question.
Yes. So the second half of that question, keeping the framing of that first half in mind, how has this changed as millennials and Gen Z households spend more?
I was going to say, I think we're covered by fair harbor provisions here. So this is not investment advice, but I've been chatting about this with my friend Connor Sen, who's an investor out of Atlanta. And he would argue that perhaps we'll see the next boom in the equities markets will be as those millennial households, particularly age into later middle age. The oldest millennials turned 40 last year, and we start to see that sort of as they reach their peak earning years. And as it happened, I believe I don't recall if I spoke about this the last time I was in front of you, but I was putting the finishing touches on a report that I started before the pandemic on where millennial families would move, how they would satisfy this. And many of the patterns that were true before the pandemic held true as well. They chose to basically move to some of those developments, like I showed you, Avalon and others, or moving to Sunbelt metros where they could try to basically solve for the most satisfactory life they could have, which was moving to exurbs where there are housing starts, where you could find affordable drive until you qualify housing. But they could also drive or walk to these sort of dense environments like an Avalon, where you could have some of the urban amenities they left behind. And it'll be very interesting to sort of see, I think the millennials perhaps will turbocharge suburbia, given the financial constraints they have, but it won't be their boomer parent suburbia. It will be these places dotted with these more walkable enclaves, where we might just start to see, for example, I'll just give you one, Hub 121 in McKinney, Texas, that was breaking ground right about now. The mixed-use development at its core has 4 indoor-outdoor bar spaces and restaurants with areas for children to play, ringed with flex workspaces. And I love the idea there, because the idea that people will come together in a safe place where they can watch their children, but their children can be separate, and then perhaps afterwards, after having a beer or two, they'll go get some work done. That speaks to a particularly sort of post-pandemic trend. So it'll be interesting to see more of those projects as they come through the pipeline, as what millennials want or what their expectations are from that blurring of live, work, play, and childbearing.
Thank you, Greg. I think we have time for one more question. If we don't get to your question today, for the folks in the audience, please rest assured we'll be following up with you after the session via email. Our last question for the session here reads, do you think rural communities are prepared for the influx of millennials/Gen Z looking to move from the large urban centers into more rural communities? How do you think this will impact housing and commodity prices?
They're not prepared, and I think this is actually a big push. Tying this back to the question earlier about the most climate resilient region in America, if it is at a state level, it's Vermont. Moving to Vermont will not fix our problems in America, because Vermont also has some of the most stubborn NIMBY opposition to building new housing. Older residents there, there are documented cases where they buy vacant developable land and put it into trust so that no one could ever build there. So I think we're having this sort of generational push-pull, an urban-rural push-pull, where there's a lot of places in America where we should be building more housing and building new communities. But of course, that desire to keep things exactly as you have it and as good as you have it is fighting that as well. And it'll be very curious to see how this plays out. The one example there, I'd say, as a counter-trend is what we just saw in California, where the legislature and Governor Newsom signed far-reaching bills that will allow construction of new developments near transit stops with no parking minimums, and really sort of pulling the shackles off some of this zoning that will allow denser housing to be built. I think we're going to need more of that. And we're going to need it in these more rural areas as well as we need it in cities. And I would never recommend building sprawl and building, low density single family homes, but allowing people to move to these climate resilient regions where they have the amenities and lifestyles they want. I think we should be welcoming them, not trying to drive them away. So we'll have to see how that plays out, but I hope other states, legislatures will follow California's lead and allow those kinds of developments to proceed.
Thank you, Greg. Well, with that, we've reached the top of the hour. Do you have any parting remarks for the audience today?
No, thank you, of course, all again for coming. I think these questions in particular have been great and highlighted, I think, again, some of these really interesting dichotomies and push-pulls and some of the disturbances we still see going through the U.S. economy at large, particularly with the built environment. The question there that touched upon commodity prices. I mean, obviously what we've seen with lumber prices and others throughout the pandemic, it'll be really interesting as we sort of move into this challenging financial environment with much higher interest rates about, how do we allocate capital more effectively and how do we choose to invest and what will our desires be as we emerge through this period. So I don't know, I think the rest of the 2020s are not going to be the roaring 20s that we'd hoped for a year ago as we were emerging from the pandemic, but I think it's still like tons of opportunities here and a way to rethink how and where we live. And I look forward to all the roles that you will play in doing that. So thank you so much for your time and for having me.
Wonderful. And thank you, Greg, for the great presentation to kick off our Building Opportunity Conference for this year. For the audience, thank you for being engaged and submitting your questions. Again, we will be following up via email if we couldn't answer your question on air. If you met all CPE requirements, your certificate is available to download now in the CPE progress window. And again, if you can't get to it today, a copy will be emailed to you within about 2 weeks or so. As a reminder, if you attended today's presentation in a group and would like to receive CPE credit, you need to complete the group attendance sheet found in your console. And now appearing in your web browser is a link to an online survey for today's presentation. Please take a moment to complete the survey as your feedback is very important to us. Thank you again for joining our webcast. We hope you'll be joining us again soon for the next session in our Building Opportunity Conference series next week. Thank you all very much. Take care and have a wonderful day.